President Donald Trump's proposed plan to end the war in Ukraine would require Kyiv to give up territory to Russia and dramatically scale back its military, according to a draft obtained by the Associated Press.
President Trump has made it very clear since day one, and even on the campaign trail, that he wants to see this war come to an end. He has grown increasingly frustrated with both sides of this war, Russia and Ukraine alike, for their refusal to commit to a peace agreement. But nevertheless, the president and his national security team are steadfast in seeing this war come to an end, to end the killing and deliver on the president's promise. Special Envoy Witkoff, that Marco Rubio, have been working on a plan quietly for about the last month. They've been engaging with both sides, Russia and Ukraine, equally to understand what these countries would commit to in order to see a lasting.
The proposal would also block any future expansion of NATO, a major win for Moscow, which has long viewed the alliance as a threat. In exchange, $100 billion in frozen Russian assets would be redirected toward rebuilding Ukraine. The draft, which stems from negotiations between Washington and Moscow, appears heavily weighted in Russia's favor.
So you said this is a good plan. So according to our sources, this proposal demands major concessions from Ukraine and doesn't demand much from Russia. So was Russia involved in drafting
Your
this?
understanding is wrong. Have you read the full plan? You haven't.
Sources said.
Yes.
So if you can give details,
You've read reporting from one side of the war. And so I want you to understand that the administration has talked equally with both sides. You have seen President Trump engage directly with both President Putin and President Zelensky. Likewise, his national security team has as well.
President Vladimir Zelensky, after talks with a top U.S. Army official on Thursday, said that he was ready for honest work with Washington on a plan to end the war in Ukraine, while European allies pushed back against punishing concessions to Russia.
Good morning. So we have a very packed agenda today. So first we're going to discuss Ukraine. We had a very good plan to discuss very specifically what more can we do with the shadow fleet, because it really has an effect on Russia's revenues to finance this war. But of course now we are going to discuss also the recent news. What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear. Also, we have to understand that in this war there is one aggressor and one victim, so we haven't heard of any concessions on the Russian side. If Russia really wanted peace, it could have agreed to unconditional ceasefire already some time ago, whereas we see again over this night bombings of civilians. 93% of Russian targets have been civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, to really kill a lot of people and cause as much suffering as possible. So this is our standing.
The deputy permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations told members of the Security Council that it had reviewed a draft U.S. peace plan to end its war with Russia, but it would not give away any territory.
Since the beginning of this year, Ukraine has supported President Trump's proposals aimed at ending the war. We are ready as before to work constructively with the American side as well as with our European partners and around the world, so that the outcome is peace. Ukraine has officially received from the American side a draft plan. We outlined the fundamental principles that matter to our people. We agree to work on the plan's provisions in a way that would bring about a just end of the war. While Ukraine stands ready to engage in meaningful negotiations to end this war, including at the leaders' level, our red lines are clear and unwavering. There will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as Russian. Our land is not for sale.
I'm now joined by our correspondent, Adam Zivo, to discuss the latest on the U.S.-Russia peace plan. Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you walk us through what the concessions are in this deal?
So the concessions ultimately amount to a capitulation of the Ukrainian side. So what Russia wants is for Ukraine to give up the rest of its eastern Donetsk province, which is currently about 70% occupied by Russia. So Ukrainian troops would withdraw to surrounding areas, and then that withdrawal zone would be turned into a demilitarized buffer area. Now, the problem here is that this is where the bulk of Ukraine's most important defensive fortifications are located, including a belt of fortress cities that have been built up over several years, right? So basically, they're asking Ukraine to give up its most important defensive fortifications. The front lines in the southern provinces of Zaporizhia and Kherson would be frozen. And then, under this plan, any area occupied in those provinces, as well as the entirety of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, would be recognized as Russian territory. Then the Ukrainians would be expected to cap the size of their armed forces to 600,000 personnel, which is about a 25% reduction from current numbers, but there is no reciprocal limitation on Russia's military. On top of that, Ukraine would be banned from joining NATO and would be banned from hosting any NATO troops, and that would preclude the possibility of any credible European peacekeeping force to enforce any peace deal, right? Uh, so all of this from the security side would leave Ukraine incredibly vulnerable to a future invasion, which is why many see it as capitulation. Now, there are many pro-Russian incentives here. So the idea is that Russia would have its sanctions lifted in stages on a case-by-case basis, would be readmitted into the G7, making it the G8 again,
Mhm.
and then the United States and Russia would sign an economic cooperation agreement that would specialize in energy, Arctic rare metals, infrastructure, and a few other economic zones. Now, the Americans are pushing the idea of using some of Russia's frozen funds to reconstruct Ukraine. So currently, there are about 300 billion Russian funds that are frozen in Western institutions. So the United States wants to take one third of this and
Mhm.
use that to create a redevelopment fund, and then ask the Europeans to take $100 billion of their money and put that into this fund as well. And so this would be used to A, reconstruct Ukraine, but also B, to extract Ukraine's natural resources and minerals. And what's very telling here is that 50% of the profits of any ventures funded by this investment fund would go towards the United States. So this is not a reconstruction fund per se. It is a vehicle for the United States to essentially extract wealth from Ukraine going forward. In a similar way to the way that they proposed that predatory mineral deal earlier this year. Now, the remaining frozen Russian funds, the $200 billion, would be set aside and used for joint Russo-American investments to build a relationship between Moscow and the United States with this idea that this would deter further conflict. So basically, the Americans want to appropriate Russian money to benefit themselves, whether it comes through extracting Ukrainian wealth or using that money to do joint ventures with Russia.
Well, and Adam, we know that Zelensky has long said that Ukraine will not give up territory. But now that he said that he's open to working with this deal, does that suggest that his position is shifting, or does he maybe know something that the public doesn't know yet?
I mean, it's widely understood that he has to say what he needs to say to keep the Americans on side. But if he were to try to accept permanent territorial concessions, then that could either lead to a revolution in Ukraine because that idea is deeply unpopular, or it could create a slew of legal troubles because Ukraine, it's not a dictatorship. They have a constitution, and that constitution requires a referendum if you're going to cede any territory. But that referendum would fail because Ukrainians do not like this peace deal.
Well, and there is also talks that this is just a stall tactic on Putin's part to avoid further sanctions. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think so. I mean, we've seen time and time again where Putin has claimed that he is genuinely interested in peace talks and has only come to the table with maximalist demands that everyone else can see are unworkable because they would leave Ukraine vulnerable to further conquest, annexation, or vassalization. And the Europeans have long understood that Putin is not genuinely interested in peace and that he only engages in these talks to stall and to confuse, which is why the Europeans pushed for an immediate ceasefire and very tough sanctions earlier this year. But Trump, for whatever reason, can't seem to get through his head that Putin can't be trusted, and is always entertaining these talks, even though it's clear that they're going nowhere.
Now, we do have just about a minute left, but how vulnerable is the Russian economy to further sanctions?
I mean, so it's proven quite resilient, but right now the Russian economy is sputtering. They have high inflation, high interest rates, and they've drained many of their reserves. But they do still make a lot of money when it comes to oil. They have a shadow fleet of tankers that operate beyond sanctions. And if that fleet was to be targeted, then that could really undercut Russia's oil economy and starve its war machine of resources.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.